Welcome to our series of public forums, which we had kind of let go during the summer to give you a little break. We've picked up again with two very dear and important guests. Ambassador Hans-Jochen Schmid is usually a regular of our forums, sitting over there. It's very nice to have him sitting here today. And Ambassador John Evans has not been to Armenia for 5 years. He left 5 years ago this month. And we're very happy that he's here now with us today. Ambassador Evans is also going to speak here at a Civilitas event, not here, but at the Yerevan Hotel at the Rossini on Thursday at 2 o'clock in our other series called 100 Questions and Answers. And at that time, you will all have plenty of opportunity to ask him all sorts of questions, including the genocide question, if you so desire, and the 5 years he's spent since he left Armenia. But today, we're going to talk about something else. Today, we're going to talk about the 20 years of independence. Some of you remember that a few months ago, we had invited 3 journalists who cover the region to talk again about these 20 years of independence in the Caucasus, seen from the perspective of journalists who cover the region very closely, who cover it possibly more closely than some of us do. Today we're going to look at the same question really from the perspective of 2 diplomats. Ambassador Schmid currently serving. Ambassador Evans served for nearly 3 years, 2 years something, about 5 years ago. So really they're looking at slightly different time periods, but still with the same questions. And I'd like to start with our question, and that is, it often seems to me, at least, that we started these 20 years of independence with a couple of extra points in the international world. Armenians were known around the world. Armenia has been on the map for a long time. We had a whole lot of extra credit assigned to us. And there were high expectations of us. Did we meet them? Ambassador Schmid?
I think at the beginning of your independence process, to put it that way, you had to live up to a lot of challenges. And that probably had a negative impact on the development of your country in comparison with the development of countries like in the Baltic area. Because very often I've got confronted with the question, why is Armenia not so well developed like, for example, Estonia? And there are certain reasons why Estonia did develop that way or not the other way. And Armenia had to cope with a lot, first of all, conflictual situations, Azerbaijan, then with a lot of economic problems. I was very, with interest, I heard comments being made by Armenians having attended the independence, the parade and celebrations. And somebody said, yeah, you left us in 91 and you come back and you're surprised about the situation Armenia is living in at the moment. Positive, yeah, 91. And they wanted and criticized that they were not allowed to listen to the music outside. And they said, why are we here in a cage in the Marriott Hotel? And somebody said it's because of security. And then positively, they opened the windows and they became part of the Jubilee celebrations. But I think that is one of the difficulties of your country. Let's say you got confronted with the war, Azerbaijan. You got confronted with a huge migration. That was the first wave. You have at the moment, I think, the second or the third wave? And that is certainly, migration has had probably a very negative impact. One should not underestimate the positive sides as well. For example, in the mid-90s, most of the people I met said, having been abroad, and the Armenians as well, have not gone through the nightmare, for example, not disposing of enough water, not disposing of enough electricity. And that is, by the way, one of the reasons why this, energy question concerning Armenia is such a highly emotional one. For example, nuclear power plant.
Ambassador Evans, expectations?
In this discussion, I think we should back off a little bit and look at these last 20 years against some of the major trends in the world, if we're to understand correctly what has been happening. And let's think about it. The Soviet Union ended at the beginning of the 90s. Let's think also of the rise of the internet and globalization. Let's think about the worldwide progress towards greater democracy and especially empowerment of women. And looked at against the background of these major tendencies, Armenia is now positioned, I think, in a very good place. Now, some have regretted the demise of the Soviet Union. I think few in Armenia, in the long run, regret it. In fact, it's because Armenia started the process, if you go back to 1988. If you look at globalization, Armenians are already globalized through the diaspora. This is nothing new. This is a society which is very good at assimilating not only technology but other trends.
So with all those cards that we were holding, did we meet your expectations? Because I know we didn't meet ours, so.
No, I don't think anybody is trying to give a grade. I mean, there was a certain situation, I totally agree with all these points. I mean, Armenia had the earthquake in 1988, the economic dislocations that came with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the costs of the war, and there are other things that one could also name. But there was a good foundation laid. It's not perfect. This is maybe not, I'm going on too long. I want to get back to your question, Safi.
Well, now let me ask the same question another way then. We appreciate it when others also recognize that an uphill battle doesn't begin to describe what we were up against. And it's reality. Those are the objective factors that cannot be questioned. Still, in retrospect, can we say that there were points when we could have made different decisions than the ones we made? And now I'm asking about us, but I'm going to ask the same thing of the region, huh? Are there different decisions that we could have made?
It's for me very difficult, let's say, when you have discussions with one of your former presidents, the criticism voiced is that he laid the foundation for the situation we have been confronted with at the moment. And from my point of view, it is dishonest not to recognize that. For example, I brought in the other day deputies, and there was an exchange of views. And at least I think the former president should recognize why, for example, we have been confronted with a situation like this one today, because he is in a certain way responsible for it. And the other question is, and I totally agree, how much political will the leadership disposes of to implement certain reforms? That is, I think, probably the crucial issue. There are a lot of transformation Armenia has been undergoing. For example, referring to the constitution, it's certainly a very good constitution, but the question is, if legislative acts after having been adopted according to the constitution are implemented in the same way.
So back to
and that is in a certain way certainly a criticism voiced. The other one, and I get criticized for mentioning and referring to that, for example, the economic order. You have, to live up to the challenge if you want to become or to get closer to the European Union, that you have to live up to certain challenges. For example, competition-wise, investment climate. You can't just refer, to certain legislative acts and say they are good, but you have to prove that they are implemented accordingly, the spirit behind. And there is, from my point of view, still a lot of steps to be undertaken. And Armenia, certainly correctly, is proud of having closed already successfully a lot of chapters in the association agreement, but we live up now to an enormous challenge. For example, if Armenia and the European Union wants to get implemented, what is the next steps necessary for leading this process, deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, to a successful outcome. And that is difficulty. For example, it's what is just the EU is interested as far as corruption is concerned. The EU is interested how the customs is performing. The EU is interested how the competition authorities will live up to certain challenges. The EU is interested how the next elections will proceed, and so on.
Sure.
And if you say expectations, what is it you lived up to successfully? For example, if we refer to 2008, certainly not. And of course, there is, what is it now? What is it? A lot of interest how you will face up to the next step. What is it? That's the elections next year and the presidential elections.
Ambassador Evans, hindsight is a great thing.
Yes, everything seems so clear in hindsight. I would just note that in the United States, we're still arguing about the meaning of our Constitution some 230 years later. And
That's reassuring, actually. It's
Sorry?
also a good example. It's reassuring. That's as it's going to go on. It's a work in progress.
You know, I think during the 5 years that I've been away, I know there have been difficulties. I've been following it carefully. But I have to say unequivocally that I see great improvements. And of course, it's mainly here in the capital. I see new stores. I just yesterday picked up the yellow pages for Armenia. It's unbelievable, the number of businesses and organizations that have been established. So what I see is a definite move forward. Now, is this to say that, that we're in paradise here? No. There are clearly shortcomings. I see many shortcomings in all countries, starting with my own. So, you know, I understand, Salpi, why you've begun our discussion by asking what is the report card. And I have to say that while I might not award a Peťorka, it would be pretty high up there, because I see a lot of improvements in many areas, and not to ignore. I haven't had a chance to visit the countryside, the smaller towns, but the Millennium Challenge activity, that is the construction of canals that has been going on to help the countryside. The construction phase ends this week, and I've seen the figures on this. It hasn't solved all the problems, but that also is making a difference.
And Ambassador Schmid said,
Millennium, unfortunately, will move out of the country. The decision has been taken for certain reasons. The EU, in its implementation of the neighborhood policy, came forward with the same slogan, for more. And the question is how Armenia will live up to. I think that Millennium did leave. That was, I think, for some people, an awakening experience. And Millennium, and the other day I referred to certain, processes Armenia has to live up to. And I got criticized for that I dared to refer to designing tendering processes that way or not the other way. It was particularly somebody of Millennium who had already voiced criticism before I came out with such a statement. Of course, afterwards they tried, as far as the North-South corridor is concerned, to improve the design of the tendering processes. But as you said, there is, of course, progress underway. But of course, they could do far better. So you have in the government, you have fantastic experts. The team of the Prime Minister partially is excellent. They're doing a fantastic job. For example, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Finance, the central bank disposes of fantastic experts. They are highly qualified, and particularly the central bank pays the adequate salaries. But as far as I know, it's the only institution in Armenia paying adequate salaries. No other institution, according, to our understanding, pays adequate salaries. The other thing is, for example, if you have such an ongoing jubilee, celebration, And for example, like in the Marriott, let's say somebody said to me, in Russia, the trade unions are far, more critical towards, making sure that certain, workers' rights are respected more than here. And that is for me amazing that an international company like Marriott is not forced to pay, for example, better salaries, just as an example.
Let me ask my same question backwards. Is it, no? Can't imagine. Development is something that both the United States and the EU have put a lot of time, money, resources, know-how, encouragement into. I mean, the amount of funds spent in Armenia on various development projects that come from your citizens' resources. In hindsight, might some of that have been done in different ways? What has been effective, in your opinion, and what has not been effective?
Well, once again, we all can think of things that we might have done a little differently. I would, in the American experience of the last 20 years, I would point to just a couple of things. I do think that our program of vouchers to help the dislocated population in the earthquake zone, although it could have been better, I think it was quite successful. It was a good model for trying to regenerate the housing market in and around Gyumri. The second program I would point to with great satisfaction was that of the United States Department of Agriculture working in the countryside, helping goat farmers, helping to establish, for example, proper slaughterhouses for the processing of meats, and helping growers or producers of wine to improve their consistency. And there are other examples as well. I do think that the Millennium Challenge, it's unfortunate, but it's well known why the program was stopped at 177 million. A certain amount of road construction was not done. That everybody knew the rules of the game here. It had to do with Armenia's slipping behind in objective categories having to do with what we call ruling justly. And this happened after March 2008. Now, the U.S. side showed, I think as much, some would say too much, tolerance, hoping that the situation would be corrected. It wasn't, and therefore we were as good as our word, and we capped the program at 177 million. However, let's look at what was done with that amount of money. Again, it's not perfect. There have been criticisms of some of the construction and so on, but that was a program run by an Armenian organization. It was a complex engineering and financial program. By the way, it should be mentioned on Thursday night this week by the H1 station. There'll be a little segment on that. So let's look at those good things. It's always interesting to, history doesn't know the subjunctive, as they say in Russia.
That's a good sentence. If we can talk about the content of the programs, we can talk about the way in which development money has been leveraged or not. Is that a question? Is it a question for the EU? There's what was done, and then there's how it was done, and its multiplicatory value and use as a card.
It's easier for me to refer to the bilateral approach, Germany's approach. I think certainly we have been investing a lot in drafting, getting adopted legislative acts, for example, constitution. I would consider as extremely helpful and fruitful the cooperation at, for meetings between German judges and judges here at the highest level. And I could myself attend a lot of these meetings, and I must say personally I was surprised about the openness, the criticism voiced partially in these meetings concerning implementation. But I must say it's a long-term process. I would say as far as what is legal cooperation is concerned, it's a good approach. It's worth being pursued. We, for example, contributed with others like the Council of Europe in getting drafted new, law for assembly, electoral law. We try, it's certainly not very easy. We get criticized partially in Western Europe for such a cooperation. In other countries, we got criticized for that as well. I think we have to, nevertheless, we have to try very hard to, to work with the police forces. We should work with the General Prosecutor's Office. And there is an interest, a mutual interest, but we shouldn't expect immediately a positive outcome of. The EU approach, and particularly the German approach, is it should be tied aid. It should not be, from my point of view, budgetary aid unconditionally, granted to, but it should be tied program-related, support.
Before we open this up to the public, let's talk about the region a little bit and whether 20 years ago you saw this as a region. Do you see it as a region today? Are we talking about 3 different countries, total bilateral relations, or is there a hope in hell that this place will be a region?
I remember when the South Korean ambassador came through here, it must have been in about 2006, from Moscow to open the South Korean consulate. And he summed it up. He said, you know, out in Northeast Asia, when we unify the Korean Peninsula, we're going to have a big voice in the world. And here in the Caucasus, if you could do the same thing, you would have a very big voice in the world. I mean, everyone sees the South Caucasus, we have to distinguish the South Caucasus, as potential, as geographically, and in other ways, potentially, a region. It's a troubled region, and it's clear that these troubles are not going to be easily overcome, but still, everyone understands that if the problems can be overcome and unblocked, there's huge potential for this area. And just in the background, I would like to keep in mind this very unpredictable shift of geometry that is taking place in the Middle East today. We don't know where this is going to end up, but it's very important not to lose sight of what's happening. There are some fundamental changes taking place in the region, involving very much your neighbor to the west, Turkey. There's been mention of a possible emerging Pax Turkica in the Middle East. So one has to think about the future with an eye to what shifts may be coming.
Ambassador Schmid, Germany is hugely present in Georgia. Your colleague there, colleague in Baku, is this a subject of discussion? Is this a region?
Just to give you an idea about it, we try to cooperate with the Southern Caucasus, and for certain reasons, we initiated what's called the Southern Caucasus Strategy 5 years ago. And we have at the moment, the Eastern Partnership Summit, or in the next 2 days. And of course, there's a lot of efforts undertaken by the European Union as well to foster regional cooperation. It's extremely difficult, but one should try very hard. For example, our political foundations, they organize a lot of conferences, forums where members of all the 3 different states take part in, even partially Turkey. As far as economic cooperation is concerned, we have not yet been able, to produce positive results. As far as energy cooperation is concerned, you know better than I that unfortunately, because of the situation, Armenia is more or less, excluded. Let's say all the pipeline issues, that's solved without, Armenia? Armenia is not very happy about. Therefore, I think there's a discussion about the final declaration. Of course, it would be very helpful if there is movement towards solving the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, because that would have a positive impact. My personal feeling, just to insist, because I was criticized for commenting very often on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict with an insight to Azerbaijan and so on, but I would say it would be extremely helpful. I know it's very difficult to convince the population for making compromises, But personally, I'm extremely afraid that Armenia may fall back more and more behind the development of the two others. And that would be detrimental to Armenia. And it would be, of course, extremely important from my point of view to get opened the frontier between Armenia and Turkey, because from my point of view, it would have a positive impact on the economic development and would give Armenia far more, how do you say, politically maneuvering freedom than at the moment.
Perfect entry into my last question. It is, as an Armenian, we, I think, can very fairly say that in the Armenia-Turkey mess, we have given all we have to give, and that we do, in fact, want an open border and normal relations. And as an Armenian, it is so logical and rational for me to say, if the Americans and if the Europeans would simply say to Turkey, look, you want this, you don't want this, Baku's giving you trouble, we understand, but really, for your own sake, with the EU, for your own relations, with the US, this is something you need to do for us. You can make us the bad guy. Go tell Baku you're doing this because we made you do it. But it has to be done. From our perspective, there is no other way to move Baku off its, Ankara, off of its position, unless there's some external pressure, because using Karabakh as leverage is clearly not succeeding, is not going to succeed. Then there is nothing that Armenians can do. Am I being naive?
Salpi, I've never known you to be particularly naive. I do think, though, that there is a tendency of people here in the Caucasus, in all three of the aforementioned countries, to seek external allies or external forces to solve their problems. And I think this is a broader problem of post-Soviet society, where so often if there was a problem, it was sent to Moscow for resolution, usually both parties sending the problem to Moscow. And what the West has developed over centuries of practice is institutions and habits of thought and so on that provide for solution of problems not by reference to some outside authority, but in a more organic way. And this is why the three mediators in the Minsk group are not going to impose a solution on Azerbaijan and Armenia. The three mediating countries, and backed by the rest of the OSCE, want Armenia and Azerbaijan to find a way to solve this locally. And the same.
That's on Karabakh, but Turkey?
Well, you know, it's very easy to say that the United States can just go to Turkey and tell them what to do. That's not true. Now, you know, we have sometimes difficult relations with Turkey. If you remember, on the eve of the war in Iraq, the Turkish parliament turned down our request to send troops through the north, into northern Iraq. So, you know, rather than expecting someone from outside to solve the problems, I think people here need to find those solutions. And they will find that if they do, the rest of the world will support them.
Okay, the Americans can't push them. Can the Europeans push them?
It's maybe unfair to compare situations which are in a certain way different. But, for example, third countries played certainly a role in trying to get solved certain conflictual problems in the former Yugoslavia. Somebody said the other day to me, a Dayton-like procedure concerning both, put its way, both political dossiers is more or less excluded because for certain reasons there was a certain American interest, I think, in getting solved this issue, the Turkish-Armenian border problem. But for certain reasons, as far as somebody said to me, somebody of the players was not willing to go to Istanbul to take part, for example, in a high-level meeting. The other, of course, I totally agree that it's up to the players and up to the political leaderships to, how do you say, to make use of their political will to, as I said, to be, how do you say, in favor of accepting certain compromise formulas. I have to be careful, and I want only to talk about Armenia and my impression. I think there's a lot of political frustration, let's say, felt by those who were very much interested in getting solved this issue, the border issue. And that probably, unfortunately, has an impact on, Karabakh, the approach as well. From my point of view, and there I'm speaking as a kind of lawyer, it is for me difficult to accept as a lawyer. I said, you start a negotiation process, you get, how do you say, a signature, and then afterwards you say, no, the ratification is something totally different. Let's say, from our understanding, that is not, how do you say, coherent. And therefore, I think the frustration in a certain way on this side, from my point of view, certainly justified one. And that, of course, produced a political backlash. Of course, the European Union tries, concerning, for example, Karabakh, at least to make use of their possibilities to, create a kind of momentum. And as far as the Turkish-Armenian relationship as well, we finance a lot of meetings cross-frontier, and I think it's certainly positive if parts of the population try to convince the political leadership that it would be in the interest of all to make, for example, to come to certain conclusions and to make certain compromises in order to move certain files that way or not the other way.
In other words, the Europeans aren't pushing either.
Might I have just a quick addition here? It seems to me that the first step with Turkey ought to be diplomatic relations. Now, diplomatic relations are misunderstood. The simple question of entering into diplomatic relations is widely misunderstood, including by many in my country. It is seen as a kind of friendship, a kind of saying we're going to have a rosy time now. That's not true. The fact of establishing diplomatic relations has no value attached to it other than allowing states to communicate with each other in confidence and in full awareness of who they're talking to, and to avoid megaphone diplomacy. If you think about it, I mean, first of all, we, the United States, were allied with Stalinist Russia because of supreme national interest in defeating Hitler. Russia today enjoys diplomatic relations with Japan despite a very serious and long-standing territorial dispute over the Kuril Islands. Greece and Turkey have full diplomatic relations despite the fact that they still quarrel about borders and territorial seas in the Aegean. So I think the first thing to do is to realize that no one is doing anyone a favor by establishing diplomatic relations. It's a normal thing. Now, my country, we don't have diplomatic relations with Iran at the moment, nor do we have with Cuba. And so I'm not saying it's only in this part of the world that is misunderstood.
But the EU is engaged, I think, in improving, the situation here. How do you say?
Vis-a-vis Turkey?
No, I think in all the three countries. Yeah. And of course tries to, not, for example, Solana, he was present at a signing ceremony. Let's say he was very much in favor of this, what we call kind of rapprochement, in order, what he said, to enable both countries to get solved, issues, and to look forward, not forgetting the past, of course.
Well, that's what we would like. The public's chance to ask questions. The first question.
I'm Hovhannes Nikos. I'm from Slavonic University. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity to assess our 20 years of independence with you, Ambassador. And my question would go to to both of you, if I can. And please, can we make some assessments of our domestic political process for throughout these 20 years? Can you differentiate the development of this political process in terms of state building, if we can say so, I mean, can you differentiate the process per president, per administration, or whatever? Can we say there had been 3 different ideologies of the development of this political process, or whatever? Can you put the assessment of the political process? I do understand there are diplomatic restraints, but still, thank you very much.
They'll somehow manage, I suspect.
Maybe for that reason I should start with this one, because I'm now a free man. First of all, let's remember that the political processes of any country are among the most intimate, complicated, and in many cases non-transparent of any processes at all. Now, I have noticed many times that foreign observers of what's going on in the United States politically inevitably get it so wildly wrong. It's not easy. If you're not part of the society, it's very difficult to understand really what's happening. And so I would be very humble, particularly in a complicated old society like Armenia's. I would be very reserved in trying to make any definitive conclusions about this. Certainly some things have not gone as planned and as hoped, but I would just reserve judgment on assigning blame. I'm sure there's plenty of blame to go around, as there usually is.
Yes, we have here the representative of the Council of Europe, and the new Deputy Foreign Minister just arrived here. He was in Strasbourg before. He had to cope with the aftermath 2008. And I think the dialogue between the different institutions, Council of Europe, European Union, let's say our countries, EU member states, and Armenia, ultimately, I think, produced results. It's maybe oversimplified, but that it was possible to get organized again, for example, demonstrations at the Opera Square. I think that was a positive result of the dialogue undertaken by both sides and the adoption of certain legislative acts as well. A very phonetistic remark, and maybe it's unfair to refer to that. When I talk to somebody about where and how to get organized demonstrations here in town, somebody said, oh, the Opera Square in summertime is a little bit hot, Mediterranean was better. I said, why do you come out towards me as an ambassador with such a statement? I said, it's certainly counterproductive. I said, be happy that you are allowed to demonstrate here and don't complain about the heat now. I say, and that is sometimes symptomatic. That's symptomatic for the political culture of people organizing demonstrations as well. Sorry, I'd say in Belarus I sometimes came out with very critical remarks as well. But I think that is certainly a positive outcome. A negative, as I referred always already in the past, it's a pity that I think in the 90s it was not possible to get structured the economic order in a different way and not leading to certain concentration processes. Or as I put it, in other words, Germany after World War II was forced to decartelize and to demonopolize. Here, of course, you don't have an institution imposing on Armenia, what is it, such a policy. Fortunately enough, the Eastern Partnership Initiative is not an initiative imposing on Armenia certain rules and so on. It is a partnership approach. Let's say Armenia has, how do you say, to agree upon undertaking certain reform steps. And if so, then there's a result. And in certain areas, I think we are going towards the right results. Politically, I refer to certain examples. Constitution, for example, is certainly very good.
Thank you.
Շնորհակալություն։ Արմենիանո, ես երևի հարցասող եմ Գերմանիայի դեսպանին, այնուհետև պարոն Հովհաննեսին։ Ասացիք, որ առաջին նախագահ եւ ընդհանրապես նախկին նախագահները պետք է պատասխանատվություն կրեն իրենց վրա տեղի ունեցածի համար եւ ընդհանրապես արկա իրավիճակի։ Ձեզ բարբերաբար տեսնում ենք հանրահավաքներին Լևոն Տեր-Պետրոսյանի, ըստ ձեզ քննադատությունը, որ միշտ հնչում է Դուք ինչ եք կարծում, պատասխանատվություն կրում է պարոն առաջին նախագահը եւ ընդհանրապես տեղին են քննադատությունները եւ երկրորդ հասցս պարոն Էվանս Wikileaks-ի տարբեր բացահայտումներից պարզ դարձավ, որ 2008-ին հիմնականում դեսպանատունը տեղյակ է եղել ինչ է կատարվում, քաղաքական իրավիճակին բավական տեղյակ է ամենայն դեպս այն ինչ գրվում է։ Ինչու ձեզ համապատասխան վերաբերմունք չցույց տրվեց, ինչպես գրված է Wikileaks-ում, այնտեղ ասվում է, որ մոտավորապես Լևոն Տեր-Պետրոսյանը հավաքել է 35%, այսինքն այդ դեպքում ուղղակի հնարավոր կլիներ երկրորդ փուլ անցկացնել եւ գուցե նաեւ հնարավոր կլիներ խուսափել մարտի 1-ից։ Ըստ ձեզ ճիշտ էր վերաբերմունքը եւ դիրքորոշում, այսինքն որևէ կերպ խիստ դիրքորոշում չդրվեց այդ օրերին։ Շնորհակալություն։
It is very unfair maybe to comment the policy of somebody who can't defend himself now here. But what I consider as an outsider interesting, and for certain reasons sometimes I don't interfere in ongoing discussions. Let's say, for example, Levon Ter-Petrosyan takes part with others. But hopefully I quote him correctly. He criticizes more or less all the elections as elections having been rigged. And then I said to one of his advisors, what about the elections that say he was running for? What about, political events in the time between 94 and 97? I said, as far as I'm informed, certain people were thrown into prison. And one of his advisors said, where do you get the information from? It is utterly wrong. And that is, from my point of view, not honest. Let's say, of course, it is for them difficult to tolerate referring to what was going on to what is 94, 97, and to compare it with the situation in 2008. Somebody said, if you read the New York Times that time and that time, the comments were more or less similar. And I think one should be so honest, at least to recognize, firstly. Secondly, of course, let's say, nobody here likes to hear the word, oligopolies or oligarchs. But as far as I know, because of his policy at that time, that was the beginning of the process towards an oligarchization of this economy here. And he has to, he has to accept that as a criticism. That's all I would like to say.
Ambassador Evans, WikiLeaks.
Yes. I wasn't here in 2008. I, of course, followed that, and I'm aware of the WikiLeaks revelations and so on. The great thing about elections, if they are perceived as having been fairly conducted, is that they confer legitimacy on the winning party. There are rules for having elections, and the great benefit is that if you win an election fairly and squarely, then everybody knows you are the people's choice. So every time there is even the widespread perception that an election was not fair, it is chipping away at the legitimacy of whoever ends up by one means or another to be the winner. Certainly there have been flawed elections. Probably some have said to me that the best election was the first one, and that subsequent ones have been flawed. But I'm coming from the country where in the city of Chicago, the motto was vote early and vote often. Democracy is a work in progress. No democracy has ever come into existence on the face of this earth as a fully blown democracy, as Athena sprung from the mind of Zeus. It doesn't happen. We all have to work to perfect our democratic systems, and there are steps forward and back and to the side. And certainly March 2008 was a step backward. It had negative consequences for the society and for Armenia's image in the world, for the Millennium Challenge account, and so on. So things do have consequences.
Thank you. There's a question way back there. Sona.
Thank you, esteemed ambassador's guests. I have the question for Mr. Evans. You are known as a person who has used a very audacious diplomatic language in the past. We all remember you for that, and you have made a real big change in that regard. You're using a very soft language now, today. Why? You used to use this, very audacious one. Now it's so soft and so diplomatic, even you're not in the office anymore. So I really wonder why.
Thank you for that question, because it reminds me of a time when I was giving a news conference after a big meeting. I think it was in Sakadzor. And one of the journalists attacked me and said, well, what you've just said in this very private meeting is what you were saying publicly. And I said, precisely the point. I'm not saying one thing in private and thinking one thing in private and saying another thing in public. If you think that I'm soft on the problems here, that's not the point. Having now been retired for 5 years, I have a longer perspective, a different viewpoint than I might have were I sitting here in the same status as my German colleague. By the way, we knew each other before in St. Petersburg. I just have a different perspective now. And of course, we're all obsessed by the latest stories and the latest events. But when you take the long-term view, it looks different. That's all it is.
Thank you. Hans-Jochen, my question is for Ambassador Schmid, and it is about a problem which has been already discussed here in some way. But I want to raise this question once again. The impression is that Georgia is the preferred partner of the European Union in this region. Is it the case? And if it is correct, can you mention the differences between Georgia and Armenia? Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's say we have here somebody who is far better informed about the ongoing negotiations. Andrei, thank you. But I have no difficulties to defend what the stance of the European Union taken, and I think the impression is correct that Armenia has been quite successful in getting advanced the association agreement negotiations. I hope that within the not so distant future, there will be the beginning of negotiations on visa liberalization. That is a success. As far as regional cooperation is concerned, of course, because you were referring to that, what we have in mind, the European Union, is, of course, by concluding these association agreements, and particularly by working on the conclusion of what's called deep and comprehensive free trade agreements, that we create, more regional trade, interregional trade, and via that, to improve the situation here on the spot, by, of course, intensifying trade with the European Union. And the different platforms we have a multilateral approach as well. And Armenia, from my point of view, is not lacking. Of course, there are certain areas the European Union, with pleasure, has been following with the fight against corruption. As far as Georgia is concerned, they have been in certain areas far more successful. But it is important that Armenia tries to live up as well. There is, the action plan being undertaken. That's to say, one should not be, so pessimistic. I think Armenia, rightly, is convinced that there's a lot of headway. But as I said, now you have, I don't know if it exists in English, you have to crack certain difficult nuts. And that is particularly in the economic sphere. I was referring to certain areas. Let's say it sounds very technical. How do you say, what is it, intellectual property rights, sanitary, phytosanitary standards, customs, and so on. But they have to do their homework as far as implementation is concerned. But I think there is a lot, let's say we do not favor Georgia, to put it that way.
Right here.
Hello, I'm Navart Sununu, graduate of Yerevan State Linguistic University. Before asking a question, I want to say that I'm a representative of the younger generation, and I want to go back to the topic of independence. I want to say I still remember I was 3 years old with my parents at the Liberty Square when people were shouting yes for independence. And as I was growing up, I saw the development of the country, and I am proud that my diaspora parents didn't leave the country. They remained in the country, overcoming all the difficulties. And now I'm proud of this country. I want to ask John Evans, as you left for some time, you should have seen the developments, the changes that have been here. And I want to mention one more thing. Beside me is sitting another diaspora Armenian who came to live permanently in Armenia from the US. Thank you very much.
Please.
This wasn't really a question, but I sense a certain challenge. Let me just say this. Earlier, I said that I thought Armenia was well positioned in the world as we see it changing. And I think that's really true. For example, what counts in today's world, certainly protection of intellectual property rights, a good legal system, a good business climate, and those things tend to be correlated also with political freedoms and what we call ruling justly, rule of law. Land is not so important these days. This may be the age of the small state coming. Look at Singapore. Look at other fairly small states that have managed to create a special environment. The internet is also aiding small states. It's making the world accessible even if you don't have a seaport of your own. So all the things that this younger generation is native to. You are the independence generation. You are natives of the internet and of new ways of doing things. And so I think that you will be the ones to help Armenia compete in this world that we see coming into existence.
May I just make one comment? I would like to refer to the film having been shown during your celebration at the Independence Square. There was, as far as I remember, no reference made to a demonstration you should be very proud of, I think 64, in favor of the construction of the genocide memorial. You had, as far as I remember, hopefully correctly, and of course I read it, what is 50,000 people there taking, what is it, the destiny in their hands and said, we would like to get built this genocide memorial. And you should be proud of that it was possible to get organized such a demonstration with a positive outcome. And I think referring to that event is not anti-Russian or anti-Soviet, but it shows what is civic courage. And that is something I think you should refer to and you should be proud of.
Thank you. Mr. Oskan.
Vartan Oskayan, Civilitas. Well, I will say this. I will start as a comment, may end up with a question. But whatever it is, I'm saying it in a semi-humorous way, because there's only some truth in this. you ambassadors and I know that diplomacy and its purpose is to develop relations between countries, advance relations. Now that I'm leading the WikiLeaks, not only the Armenia part, but also the rest of the world, I'm coming to the conclusion that diplomacy has been the main obstacle to develop ties between countries. If some of the comments you guys that sent to your superiors was told directly to my face, our relations maybe today would have been better, and Armenia's democratic situation could have been much better. There's no doubt about it. What interests me in the WikiLeaks is not what I said or other officials said, because we know what we said, and more or less you communicated, pretty accurately. But your comments that goes at the end of the WikiLeaks is most interesting. Where do you get a sense of how our comments or what we said was perceived, what you really thought was right or wrong, whether you believed in what we said, and also the kind of things that you communicated about events in Armenia that was never told publicly. Now that Armenia has passed its 20th years, we are a mature country. Don't you think it's time now we just put diplomacy a bit aside and adopt honesty is the best policy approach, so that things will move more in the right direction as we see things together and be more honest about it? Why I'm raising this issue at this moment? One is because it's the WikiLeaks. Now we understand more what's going behind the scenes. And secondly, I think the next parliamentary elections in Armenia will be extremely critical for Armenia's development for the next decade. Never been in our history of these 20 years that the political forces have created within themselves a kind of a balance that will produce a better result, more balanced parliament, and checks and balances in our political system. If we miss this opportunity, I think it will be pity. But not to miss it, I think we need some honesty, both from the United States and the European Union. Don't you think so?
Vartan.
My friend says I'm being naive.
First of all, I gave a talk on Saturday, which you'll be able to see on film, about honesty and diplomacy. And it may seem like an oxymoron to some people, but in fact, I think we are honest. There's a difference between, I think we're honest, but I do think that diplomacy needs a measure of confidentiality so that it doesn't become just grandstanding for the public. I remember the elections that took place when I was here, and I definitely was saying what I thought in those days, including in print, before the referendum that took place, in the fall of 2005. I was criticized for interfering in Armenian affairs, by the way, at that time. And I also sent a very confidential letter to a very high official of that time's government, expressing my great disappointment for the result of those elections, when I had been assured by that official that they were going to be run honestly. That letter has never been revealed. And I'm not going to say which official it was, but he, you all know his name.
I think you said before, you try, when somebody said you have become so soft, and you said you don't make so much difference in what is an opinion voiced privately or publicly. I think for me it was a fantastic educational exercise, having worked as an OSCE ambassador in Belarus, because my bilateral ambassador offered me to use the communication network of our embassy in order to exchange certain views and in order to get access to certain information. And I refused categorically for certain reasons. It was a confidence-building effort, noticed, of course, by the Belarusian Foreign Ministry. because from my point of view, they could read all the ingoing and outgoing traffic. Therefore, they had a totally crystal picture about what is my analytical work undertaken, which was partially a little bit different from what was published by the OSCE headquarters. For example, I sent out regularly speaking notes to all the high-ranking people coming over to Belarus, asking them to raise certain topics. The Belarusian side in advance knew about it. And here, it's difficult. Maybe I have a very non-conventional approach. What my analysis is concerned is not very different from what I say here publicly. Or, to put it differently, the executive is fully aware of certain opinions I have. For example, I referred, to design of tendering, was not very appreciated, but at least I'm not afraid coming out with certain criticism. That sometimes I ask, please, let's say, I don't want to go public because I would like to see that, for example, there are certain modifications undertaken, and as far as the North-South corridor tendering process is concerned, certain, modifications have been undertaken. But I think it's extremely important nowadays that diplomats are not afraid coming out in a convincing way and to draw the attention to certain deficits.
I want to thank you for coming in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week. We have coffee there for you so that you can continue this conversation amongst ourselves and with our two guests. I want to thank you for what I think was a great equal sort of conversation. I really appreciate it. We want to tell you again that Thursday at 2, Ambassador Evans will stand up at the Rossini and answer any questions you have. Please do tell our staff if you would like to come. We need to reserve seats. Thank you again, Ambassador Schmid. You're always here or here, and we appreciate your being here. Thank you. It was a pleasure having seen you again.